It started as a simple road trip. 4 friends, Ethan, Maya, Jake, and Olivia, packed their bags and set out to explore the most haunted colleges and universities in America. They laughed as they drove through winding highways, the sun shining through the windows, the air filled with excitement and the promise of adventure. They had a list of infamous campuses, each with its own chilling legend, and they planned to document everything for their new YouTube channel. The first stop was the old Hawthorne University, a sprawling campus in New England, known for its Gothic architecture and stories of restless spirits. The group arrived just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ancient stone buildings. They joked about ghosts and dared each other to spend the night in the abandoned dormitory, unaware that something was already watching them from the darkness. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere down the hall, making everyone jump. Maya's heart raced as she turned from the window, her eyes wide. Ethan grabbed the flashlight and motioned for everyone to stay close. Jake kept the camera rolling, his hands shaking slightly as they stepped into the corridor. The air felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to move just out of sight. Olivia clutched her sketchbook to her chest as they followed the sound deeper into the building. The hallway stretched on forever. The doors on either side closed tight, except for one at the very end, which slowly creaked open as they approached. A faint whisper drifted out from the darkness inside, a voice none of them recognized, calling their names one by one. The night settled in thick and heavy. The group set up their gear in the abandoned dorm room. Ethan tried to keep the mood light, cracking jokes about haunted history while Jake adjusted the camera settings. Maya wandered to the window, peering out at the moonlit quad below. Her breath fogged the glass, even though it was supposed to be a warm night. Olivia sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching the strange symbols from the walls, her pencil moving quickly as if guided by something unseen. The silence was broken only by the distant creak of old pipes and the occasional gust of wind rattling the window panes. They all felt it, a growing sense of unease, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere down the hall, making everyone jump. Maya's heart raced as she turned from the window, her eyes wide. Ethan grabbed the flashlight and motioned for everyone to stay close. Jake kept the camera rolling, his hands shaking slightly as they stepped into the corridor. The air felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to move just out of sight. Olivia clutched her sketchbook to her chest as they followed the sound deeper into the building. The hallway stretched on forever. The doors on either side closed tight, except for one at the very end, which slowly creaked open as they approached. A faint whisper drifted out from the darkness inside, a voice none of them recognized, calling their names one by one. Ethan led the way, his grip tight on the flashlight, as the group edged closer to the open door at the end of the hall. The whispering grew louder, but it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. It seemed to echo off the walls and swirl around them like a cold wind. Maya's name was the first to be called, soft and urgent, as if someone was standing right behind her. She spun around, but saw only Jake's pale face and Olivia's wide eyes. Ethan pushed the door open with his foot, and the beam of light revealed a small room filled with old furniture, draped in white sheets. The air was thick with dust and the smell of something rotten. Jake's camera flickered as if the battery was dying, even though it had been fully charged just minutes before. As they stepped inside the room, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that rattled the windows. Olivia let out a gasp and dropped her sketchbook, which landed open on the floor, the pages fluttering in the sudden draft. Ethan tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Maya's breath came in short, panicked bursts as the temperature dropped even lower. Jake's camera picked up a faint figure moving behind the sheets, a tall shadow that seemed to glide across the room without making a sound. The whispering stopped all at once, replaced by a deep silence that pressed against their ears. Then the shadow paused in the center of the room and slowly turned its head toward them, its face hidden beneath a veil of darkness. Ethan's voice was barely more than a whisper as he called out to the shadow, asking who it was and what it wanted, but the figure didn't answer. It just hovered there in the center of the room, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. Maya pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so loudly, she was sure everyone could hear it. Jake tried to focus the camera on the shadow, but the screen filled with static and strange symbols flickered across the display. Olivia knelt to pick up her sketchbook, her hands trembling as she noticed that the symbols she had drawn now glowed faintly in the dim light. The air felt thick and heavy, as if the room itself was closing in around them, and the only sound was the slow, deliberate breathing of something unseen. Suddenly, the shadow surged forward, stretching impossibly tall and wide, its darkness swallowing the weak beam of Ethan's flashlight. The friends stumbled back, tripping over the old furniture, as the temperature dropped to freezing. Olivia's breath came out in white clouds as she clutched her sketchbook to her chest, the symbols on the walls and pages pulsed with a cold blue light. The shadow's face came into view for just a moment, a hollow void where eyes should be and a mouth that seemed to whisper secrets only the dead could understand. Jake's camera died with a sharp click, plunging them into near total darkness. The only light now came from the glowing symbols and the faint outline of the shadow as it drifted closer and closer. Ethan's hand shook as he tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The wood felt ice cold beneath his fingers, and every time he pulled the handle it seemed to grow heavier. Maya pressed herself into the corner, her eyes fixed on the shadow as it hovered inches from Olivia. The air was so cold now that frost began to form on the window glass. Jake fumbled in his backpack for a spare flashlight, but his fingers were numb and clumsy. Olivia's sketchbook pulsed with that strange blue light, and she stared at the symbols as if they might offer some kind of answer. The shadow's mouth moved in slow, silent words, and suddenly the symbols on the walls began to shift and rearrange themselves as if alive. Without warning, the shadow lunged at Olivia, its form dissolving into a swirling mass of darkness that wrapped around her like a shroud. Ethan shouted her name and tried to pull her free, but his hands passed right through the cold mist. Maya screamed as the symbols on the walls flared brighter, casting wild shadows across the room. Jake's camera lay dead on the floor, its lens pointed at the chaos. Olivia's eyes rolled back as the darkness seeped into her skin, and for a moment the room was filled with a deafening silence. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the shadow vanished, leaving Olivia collapsed on the floor, her breath shallow and her skin icy cold. The symbols faded back to normal, and the door creaked open on its own, if inviting them to leave. Ethan scooped Olivia into his arms, her body limp and cold as the others hurried out of the room. The hallway outside felt just as frigid as the haunted space they'd left behind. Every step echoed in the silence, and the shadows seemed to cling to their backs. Maya kept glancing over her shoulder, certain that the shadow would follow them, but the corridor remained empty except for the flickering lights overhead. Jake's hands shook. She tried to turn his camera back on, but it was completely dead no matter how many times he pressed the button. Olivia's eyes fluttered open for a moment, and she whispered something none of them could understand, her voice thin and distant like it was coming from somewhere far away. Ethan's heart pounded as he led the group toward the exit, desperate to get outside and away from whatever had taken hold of Olivia. They burst through the heavy front doors into the night, gasping for breath as the warm summer air hit their faces. The sudden change in temperature made their skin tingle, and for a moment it felt like they had escaped something ancient and hungry. Ethan laid Olivia gently on the grass, while Maya knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. Jake scanned the building's windows with his flashlight, half expecting to see the shadow watching them from above. Olivia's eyes opened again, this time wide and glassy. She stared up at the sky and whispered the same strange words over and over, her voice growing stronger with each repetition. The others exchanged worried glances, realizing that whatever had happened inside that room wasn't finished with them yet. The campus was eerily quiet as the group huddled together on the grass. Olivia's strange chanting echoed softly in the night air. Ethan tried to comfort her, but she didn't seem to recognize any of them. Maya's hands trembled as she dialed for help, but her phone screen flickered and died just like Jake's camera. Jake paced in circles, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what they had seen. He kept glancing at the dark windows of the dormitory, certain he could see movement behind the glass. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the quad. Every instinct told them to run. But they couldn't leave Olivia behind, not when she was still trapped in whatever nightmare the shadow had brought with it. Suddenly, Olivia's voice stopped, and she sat up straight, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance. She pointed toward the old bell tower at the edge of campus, her finger trembling as she whispered that they had to go there now. Ethan and Maya exchanged worried glances, but Jake was already gathering their things, determined to find answers. The group moved quickly across the empty quad, their footsteps echoing in the silence as they approached the bell tower. The air grew colder again, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of distant bells that no one else seemed to hear. Olivia led the way, her movements strange and mechanical, as if she was being pulled by an invisible force. The others followed close behind, their fear growing with every step. The bell tower loomed above them, its ancient stone walls covered in ivy and cracks. As they drew closer, Olivia's pace quickened, her eyes never leaving the dark entrance at the base of the tower. Ethan called her name, but she didn't respond. Maya clung to his arm, her breath coming in short, nervous bursts. Jake shined his flashlight up the tower's face, and the beam caught on something high above, a shadow moving behind the broken glass of the clock face. The wind howled through the empty arches, making the whole structure groan and shudder. Olivia reached the heavy wooden door and pushed it open, without hesitation. The others hesitated for a moment, exchanging one last look before following her inside. The darkness swallowed them whole, and the door slammed shut behind them with a thunderous echo. Inside the tower, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The only light came from Jake's flashlight, which flickered as they moved deeper into the narrow spiral staircase. Olivia climbed ahead, her footsteps steady and unafraid, while the others struggled to keep up. Maya's hand brushed against the cold stone wall, and she felt something sticky and warm, like fresh blood. But when she looked, there was nothing there. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of distant bells grew louder with every step. Jake's camera was still dead, but he kept it in his hand, as if it might suddenly come back to life. The higher they climbed, the colder it got, and the shadows seemed to press in tighter around them, whispering secrets in voices only Olivia could understand. The spiral staircase seemed endless, each step creaking beneath their weight as they climbed higher into the darkness. Olivia never looked back, her hand trailing along the wall, if she knew exactly where she was going. Maya's legs ached and her breath came in ragged gasps, but she forced herself to keep moving. Ethan stayed close behind her, his eyes darting to every shadow that flickered in the corners. Jake brought up the rear, his flashlight beam trembling. It swept over faded graffiti and old cobwebs. The sound of the bells grew louder now, not just in their ears, but in their bones, a deep resonant toll that made the stone vibrate beneath their feet. The air was so cold it burned their lungs, and every instinct screamed at them to turn back, but they couldn't leave Olivia alone. At last, they reached a small landing just below the clock face. The room was filled with broken gears and rusted chains, and the shattered remains of old bells. Olivia stood in the center, her eyes fixed on a patch of darkness in the far corner. Maya shivered as she realized the shadows there were moving, swirling and twisting into shapes that almost looked human. Ethan called out to Olivia, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stepped forward into the darkness, and the shadows seemed to reach for her. Jake tried to follow, but an icy wind slammed him back against the wall. The bells above them began to ring on their own, a deafening cacophony that drowned out their screams as the shadows closed in around Olivia and swallowed her whole. The sound of the bells was so loud it felt like the whole tower was shaking. Dust rained down from the ceiling and the gears rattled in their sockets. Ethan tried to reach Olivia, but the shadows were too thick, swirling around her like a living storm. Maya screamed her name over and over, but it was lost in the deafening noise. Jake pressed himself against the wall, his eyes wide with terror, as he watched the darkness twist and pulse with every toll of the bell. Olivia's silhouette flickered in and out of view, her face blank and her eyes glowing faintly with that same cold blue light. The air was so cold now that their breath came out in thick clouds, and every inch of exposed skin stung with frost. Suddenly, the bells stopped and the silence was even more terrifying than the noise. The shadows seemed to collapse inward, pulling Olivia with them, until she vanished completely. Ethan stumbled forward into the empty space where she had been, his hands shaking. Maya fell to her knees, sobbing as Jake tried desperately to get his camera to work again, but the screen stayed black. The only sound now was the faint ticking of the broken clock above them, and the distant echo of Olivia's voice, whispering their names from somewhere deep within the darkness. The three friends huddled together in the cold, empty room, realizing that whatever haunted this place had taken Olivia, and it wasn't finished with them yet. The silence pressed in on them, so heavy it felt like the air itself was thick and suffocating. Ethan pulled Maya to her feet, his own hands trembling as he tried to steady her. Jake's face was pale and drawn, his eyes fixed on the spot where Olivia had disappeared. The broken clock above them ticked on in slow, uneven beats, each second stretching out like an eternity. Maya wiped her tears and whispered that they had to get out of the tower now, her voice barely more than a breath. Ethan nodded and led the way back to the spiral staircase, but every step felt wrong, as if the tower itself was shifting beneath their feet. The shadows on the walls seemed to move with them, always just out of reach, always watching. As they descended the staircase, the air grew colder and the darkness deeper. Jake's flashlight flickered and died, leaving them in near total blackness. Ethan gripped the railing tightly, guiding Maya and Jake down step by step, their breaths echoing in the silence. Halfway down, Maya gasped and pointed at the wall, where a series of new symbols had appeared, glowing faintly in the dark, the same symbols Olivia had drawn in her sketchbook. They pulsed with a cold blue light, leading the way down like a trail. The friends followed the glowing marks, their fear mounting with every turn of the staircase, knowing that whatever had taken Olivia was still with them, and that the nightmare was far from over. The glowing symbols led them down the last few steps and out into the base of the bell tower, where the air felt even colder than before. Ethan pushed open the heavy wooden door, but it wouldn't budge, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Maya pressed her ear to the wood and heard faint whispers in a language she couldn't understand. Jake tried his phone again, but the screen was still black and lifeless. The only light came from the blue symbols, now pulsing on the stone walls around them. Ethan pounded on the door, his voice echoing through the empty tower, but no one answered. Outside, the wind howled and the old building groaned as if warning them that they were not alone. Suddenly, the blue light from the symbols flared brighter, filling the room with an icy glow. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them until it felt like the voices were inside their heads. Maya clutched her ears and fell to her knees. Ethan tried to pull her up, but his hands felt numb and weak. Jake backed away from the walls as the symbols began to shift and change, forming new patterns that seemed to move on their own. The temperature dropped even further and frost crept across the floor. The friends huddled together in the center of the room, their breath coming in ragged clouds as the voices rose to a fever pitch and the shadows in the corners began to move again, reaching out with long, cold fingers. The shadows crept closer, swirling around the three friends as the blue light from the symbols pulsed in time with their racing hearts. Ethan tried to shield Maya and Jake, but the cold was so intense it felt like it was seeping into his bones. Maya's teeth chattered as she stared at the shifting patterns on the walls, her mind struggling to make sense of the strange shapes. Jake's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he watched the shadows stretch and twist into forms that almost looked like faces. The whispers grew louder and more urgent, filling the room with a chorus of voices that seemed to be calling out for help, or maybe warning them to leave. Ethan shouted into the darkness, demanding to know what the spirits wanted. But the only answer was a sudden gust of wind that slammed the door shut even tighter. Just as the fear threatened to overwhelm them, the blue symbols on the walls began to pulse faster, and the shadows recoiled as if afraid. Maya's eyes widened as she realized the patterns were forming a message, a warning written in a language she somehow understood. She whispered the words aloud, and the room seemed to tremble. The shadows froze in place, and the whispers fell silent for a moment. Ethan and Jake stared at her in shock. Maya's voice grew stronger, repeating the strange phrase over and over. The blue light flared one last time, and the door creaked open, just enough for them to see the night outside. The friends didn't hesitate. They rushed through the opening into the cold darkness beyond, leaving the haunted tower and its secrets behind them for now. The night air hit them like a wave as they stumbled out of the bell tower, their bodies shaking from cold and fear. The campus was silent and empty, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. Maya clung to Ethan, her mind still reeling from the words she had spoken. Jake looked back at the tower, its windows dark and empty, but he could feel something watching them from within. The blue glow of the symbols faded from the stone, as if the building itself was exhaling a long-held breath. Ethan led them away from the tower, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of Olivia or the thing that had taken her. Every step felt heavy, as if the ground itself was trying to hold them back. They made their way across the deserted quad, the moonlight casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. Maya's mind raced with questions about the symbols and the voices she had heard. Jake tried his phone again, but it was still dead, and the silence between them grew heavier with every step. Ethan stopped suddenly, his eyes fixed on a figure standing beneath an old oak tree at the edge of the quad. For a moment, none of them moved. The figure was too still, too pale to be real. Maya whispered Olivia's name, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly raised an arm and pointed back toward the bell tower, as if warning them that their ordeal was far from over. Ethan took a cautious step toward the pale figure, his heart pounding in his chest. Maya and Jake stayed close behind, their eyes wide with fear as the figure remained motionless beneath the oak tree. The moonlight revealed a face that looked almost familiar, but impossibly gaunt and hollow. Olivia's name caught in Ethan's throat as he called out again, but the figure didn't move or speak. Instead, its eyes seemed to glow faintly with that same cold blue light they had seen in the tower. The air around them grew colder, and the shadows on the ground twisted and writhed as if alive. Jake gripped Maya's arm, whispering that they should leave, but Ethan couldn't look away from the figure's empty gaze. Suddenly, the figure's mouth opened in a silent scream, and the wind howled through the quad, carrying with it the faint sound of bells. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the tree's branches creaked, as if straining under an invisible weight. Maya stumbled back, pulling Jake with her as Ethan stood rooted to the spot. The figure's arm dropped, and it began to dissolve into mist, the blue light fading as it drifted toward the bell tower. The friends watched in horror as the mist slipped through the tower's ancient stones and vanished from sight. The silence that followed was absolute, and for a moment it felt as if the entire campus was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The three friends stood in the moonlit quad, their breaths shallow and their nerves frayed. Ethan finally turned away from the spot where the ghostly mist had vanished, his voice barely more than a whisper as he told Maya and Jake they needed to get somewhere safe. Maya nodded, her eyes still fixed on the bell tower, as if expecting the blue light to return at any moment. Jake checked his watch, but the hands spun wildly, as if time itself was broken on this haunted campus. They moved quickly across the grass, their footsteps muffled by the thick silence. Every window in the surrounding buildings seemed to watch them as they passed, the sense of being hunted growing stronger with every step. Ethan led them toward the campus library, hoping the thick stone walls would offer some protection from whatever was stalking them. They reached the library's heavy wooden doors and slipped inside. The vast room was dark and cold, the only light coming from the moon filtering through stained glass windows. Rows of ancient books stretched into the shadows, and the air smelled of dust and secrets. Maya shivered as she remembered the stories about the library's haunted past. Ethan found a table near the center and motioned for everyone to sit. Jake tried to turn on his phone again, but it was still dead. The silence inside was even deeper than outside, broken only by the faint creak of the old building settling. As they huddled together in the darkness, the friends realized that the nightmare was far from over, and that the library might hold answers or more horrors waiting in the shadows. The silence in the library was so deep it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Ethan whispered that they needed to figure out what the symbols meant and why Olivia had been taken. Maya pulled out her sketchbook and flipped to the pages where she had copied the glowing patterns, her hands shaking as she traced the lines with her finger. Jake scanned the shelves for anything that looked old or out of place, his flashlight beam barely cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of old paper. Every shadow seemed to move just out of sight, and the friends spoke in hushed voices, afraid to disturb whatever spirits might be lurking among the stacks. Ethan found an old book on local legends and opened it to a chapter about the university's haunted history. As Ethan read aloud the story of a student who vanished in the bell tower over a century ago, Maya realized the symbols in her sketchbook matched the ones described in the legend. The book spoke of a ritual meant to open a doorway between worlds and warned that those who performed it risked being claimed by the shadows. Jake's hands trembled as he found a photograph tucked between the pages. It showed a group of students standing in front of the bell tower, their faces eerily similar to their own. The friends exchanged uneasy glances as the temperature in the library dropped and the shadows seemed to press in closer. Ethan's voice faltered as he read the final line of the legend, a warning that once the ritual began, it could never truly be undone. A sudden chill swept through the library, making the candle flames in the old wall sconces flicker, even though no one had lit them. Ethan closed the book with trembling hands and looked at Maya and Jake, his voice barely steady as he said they needed to find a way to reverse the ritual and bring Olivia back. Maya stared at the photograph, the faces of the students from the past blurring and shifting until she could almost see Olivia's features among them. Jake's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into near darkness except for the faint blue glow from Maya's sketchbook. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps, echoing between the shelves, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was searching for them. The footsteps grew louder, and the friends pressed together behind the table, their hearts pounding in their chests. Maya whispered that she could feel Olivia nearby, as if her presence was woven into the shadows. Ethan gripped the old book tightly, searching for any clue that might help them. Jake's eyes darted to the end of the aisle, where a figure appeared for just a moment, tall and thin with eyes that glowed blue before vanishing into the darkness. The air grew colder, and the books on the shelves began to tremble, if shaken by an invisible wind. The friends realized they were not alone in the library, and that the spirits of the past were watching, waiting for them to make their next move. The trembling books began to fall from the shelves, one by one, thudding onto the floor and sending clouds of dust swirling into the air. Ethan motioned for Maya and Jake to stay low as he crawled toward the nearest fallen book, hoping it might hold another clue. Maya clutched her sketchbook to her chest, her eyes darting between the shifting shadows and the aisle where the blue-eyed figure had vanished. Jake's breath came in short gasps as he tried to steady his nerves. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and something colder, something that smelled like winter. The footsteps returned, this time circling the table, slow and deliberate as if the spirit was toying with them. The friends pressed together, their fear mounting with every passing second. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and the silence was broken by a low whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Maya's name echoed through the library, followed by Olivia's voice calling out for help. Ethan grabbed the fallen book and flipped it open, his hands shaking as he scanned the pages for anything that might help. Jake's eyes widened as he saw the blue-eyed figure standing at the far end of the aisle, its face hidden in shadow, but its gaze fixed on them. Maya's heart pounded as she realized the figure was pointing at her sketchbook, the blue glow pulsing brighter with every heartbeat. The friends knew they had to act quickly before the spirit closed in, and the library became their tomb. Ethan's hands shook as he read the ancient text, the words blurring together in the dim blue light. Maya pressed the sketchbook to her chest, feeling its warmth pulse in time with her heartbeat. Jake kept his eyes locked on the blue-eyed figure at the end of the aisle, the spirit's presence growing heavier with every second. Ethan found a passage about a ritual of reversal, a way to close the doorway between worlds, but it required a sacrifice and the recitation of the symbols in a specific order. Maya's breath caught as she realized the symbols in her sketchbook matched the ones described in the book. The friends exchanged fearful glances, knowing that their only hope of saving Olivia might come at a terrible cost. The blue-eyed figure began to move slowly down the aisle, its footsteps silent, but its gaze never leaving Maya. The books on the shelves rattled, and the air grew colder with every step. Ethan whispered the instructions from the book, his voice barely audible over the rising wind that seemed to swirl through the library. Maya traced the symbols in her sketchbook, her fingers numb with fear. Jake stood between her and the spirit, his body tense and ready to defend his friends. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its eyes burning with an unnatural light, and the friends realized they had only moments to begin the ritual before the spirit claimed them all. Ethan's voice trembled as he began to recite the ancient words from the book, the syllables heavy and strange on his tongue. Maya followed along, tracing the glowing symbols in her sketchbook, her hands shaking with every line. Jake stood guard, his eyes never leaving the blue-eyed figure that hovered just beyond the circle of blue light. The air in the library crackled with energy, the books on the shelves vibrating as if alive. The spirit's gaze grew more intense, its form flickering between solid and shadow with every word Ethan spoke. Maya's voice joined his, the two of them chanting in unison as the blue light from the sketchbook spread across the floor, forming a protective circle around them. The spirit hissed and recoiled, but did not disappear. The wind howled through the library, slamming books to the floor and rattling the stained glass windows. Maya's voice grew stronger as she repeated the final line of the ritual, the blue light pulsing brighter with every word. Ethan's hands ached from gripping the book so tightly, but he forced himself to keep reading. Jake shouted at the spirit to stay back, his voice echoing through the vast room. The blue-eyed figure shrieked, a sound that cut through the air like ice, and the shadows on the walls writhed in agony. The friends pressed closer together as the ritual reached its peak, the blue light exploding outward in a blinding flash that filled the library with a cold, unnatural glow. The blinding blue light faded slowly, leaving the library in an eerie silence. The friends blinked against the afterimage, their hearts pounding as they looked around the room. The blue-eyed figure was gone, but the air still felt heavy and cold. Maya's sketchbook lay open on the table, the symbols now dark and lifeless. Ethan slumped in his chair, exhausted from the effort of the ritual. Jake scanned the shadows for any sign of movement, but the library was still, the only sound the distant ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Maya whispered Olivia's name, her voice trembling with hope and fear, but there was no answer. just the echo of her words bouncing off the ancient stone walls. Suddenly, the temperature dropped again, and a cold wind swept through the library. The pages of the old book flipped wildly, as if caught in a storm. Maya's hair lifted in the breeze, and the candles in the sconces flickered back to life, casting long shadows across the floor. Ethan sat up straight, as a faint voice echoed through the room. Olivia's voice calling out from somewhere far away. Jake grabbed the sketchbook, and held it out as the symbols began to glow faintly once more. The friends followed the sound of Olivia's voice deeper into the library, their footsteps echoing in the darkness as the shadows seemed to part before them, leading the way toward a hidden door at the back of the room. The hidden door creaked open, with a sound that echoed through the library like a warning. The friends hesitated for a moment, their nerves frayed and their bodies tense, but Olivia's voice called to them again, soft and pleading. Maya led the way, her sketchbook glowing faintly in her hands. Ethan and Jake followed close behind, their eyes darting to every shadow as they stepped into a narrow passageway. The air inside was colder than ever, and the walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes seeming to follow the friends as they moved deeper underground. The passage twisted and turned, the only light coming from the blue symbols that pulsed along the floor, guiding them forward into the unknown. As they moved deeper into the passage, the sound of Olivia's voice grew louder and more desperate. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and old secrets. Ethan reached out to steady Maya as she stumbled over a loose stone. Jake's flashlight flickered, but the blue glow from the sketchbook was enough to keep them moving. The passage opened into a small chamber, lined with ancient books and strange artifacts. In the center of the room stood a mirror covered in dust and cobwebs. Maya felt a chill run down her spine as she realized Olivia's voice was coming from the other side of the glass. The friends gathered around the mirror, their reflections distorted and strange as they prepared to face whatever waited for them within. The friends stared into the dusty mirror, their reflections wavering and shifting in the blue glow. Maya reached out and wiped away a patch of grime, her hand trembling as she did so. Behind the glass, she could see Olivia standing in a shadowy version of the chamber, her eyes wide with fear, and her lips moving in silent pleas for help. Ethan called her name, but his voice sounded muffled and distant, as if the mirror was swallowing the sound. Jake pressed his hand to the glass, and felt a sudden jolt of cold energy shoot up his arm. The air in the chamber grew heavier, the blue symbols in Maya's sketchbook pulsing in time with Olivia's heartbeat on the other side of the mirror. Suddenly, the mirror began to ripple like water, and Olivia's voice broke through the barrier, pleading with them to help her escape. Maya flipped through her sketchbook, searching for the right symbols as Ethan read from the ancient book. Jake kept his hand on the glass, feeling the cold intensify with every passing second. The chamber shook, if the ground itself was protesting their presence. The artifacts on the shelves rattled, and the air filled with the sound of distant bells. Maya traced the final symbol on the mirror surface, and the blue light flared brighter than ever. The friends watched in awe and terror as Olivia's hand reached out from the other side, her fingers brushing against the glass as the barrier between worlds began to thin. The blue light from the mirror filled the chamber, casting long shadows that danced across the ancient walls. Maya's heart pounded as she pressed her palm against Olivia's through the glass, feeling a cold shock run through her body. Ethan read the final lines from the ancient book, his voice steady, despite the fear in his eyes. Jake gripped Maya's shoulder for support as the mirror surface began to swirl faster, the air thick with the sound of distant bells and whispering voices. Olivia's face was so close now, her eyes pleading for help as the barrier between their worlds grew thinner. The friends could feel the pull of the mirror like a tide, threatening to drag them all into the darkness. Suddenly, the mirror cracked with a sound like thunder, and a blast of icy wind swept through the chamber, knocking the friends back. Maya cried out as Olivia's hand slipped from hers. The blue light flickered, and the symbols in the sketchbook glowed brighter than ever. Ethan shouted for everyone to hold on, as the chamber shook, and the artifacts rattled violently. Jake reached for Maya, pulling her away from the mirror, just as a shadowy figure appeared behind Olivia, its eyes burning with cold blue fire. The friends watched in horror as the shadow tried to drag Olivia deeper into the darkness, but she fought back, her eyes locked on Maya's, as the barrier shimmered and threatened to break. The chamber trembled as the shadowy figure behind Olivia grew larger, its form twisting and writhing like living smoke. Maya scrambled to her feet, her eyes locked on Olivia's desperate face. Ethan flipped through the ancient book, searching for anything that could help, while Jake steadied Maya and kept his gaze fixed on the mirror. The blue light from the sketchbook pulsed in time with the shadow's movements, casting eerie patterns across the walls. Olivia's voice echoed through the chamber, pleading for them not to let go. The mirror's cracks spread wider, and the air grew colder with every second. The friends knew they had only moments left before the barrier shattered completely, and the darkness claimed them all. Ethan found a passage about banishing spirits, and shouted the words over the roar of the wind. Maya pressed her hand to the mirror again, tracing the glowing symbols, as Jake held her steady. The shadow behind Olivia shrieked, a sound that rattled the shelves and sent ancient artifacts crashing to the floor. Olivia reached out one last time, her fingers brushing the glass as the blue light flared brighter than ever. The friends chanted together, their voices rising above the chaos. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering and shrinking as the symbols on the mirror burned with cold fire. With a final burst of energy, the mirror shattered, sending shards of blue light flying through the chamber, and the shadow vanished, leaving only Olivia's voice echoing in the silence. The chamber fell silent as the last shards of blue light faded into the darkness. Maya collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ethan rushed to her side, his hands shaking as he checked for injuries. Jake scanned the room, his heart pounding as he realized the shadow was truly gone. The mirror lay in pieces on the floor, each fragment reflecting a different part of the chamber, but none showed Olivia's face. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight of the darkness had lifted slightly. Maya stared at the largest shard of glass, her reflection warped and strange as she whispered Olivia's name. The only answer was the distant echo of her own voice, bouncing off the ancient stone walls. The chamber fell silent as the last shards of blue light faded into the darkness. Maya collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ethan rushed to her side, his hands shaking as he checked for injuries. Jake scanned the room, his heart pounding as he realized the shadow was truly gone. The mirror lay in pieces on the floor, each fragment reflecting a different part of the chamber, but none showed Olivia's face. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight of the darkness had lifted slightly. Maya stared at the largest shard of glass, her reflection warped and strange as she whispered Olivia's name. The only answer was the distant echo of her own voice, bouncing off the ancient stone walls. The friends emerged from the hidden passage into the library, their faces pale and drawn. The room was unchanged, but it felt different now, as if the shadows themselves were mourning Olivia's loss. Ethan led the way to the main doors, his steps slow and heavy. Maya clutched her sketchbook to her chest, even though the symbols no longer glowed. Jake kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see Olivia's face in the darkness behind them. The silence was thick and unbroken, the only sound their footsteps, echoing across the marble floor. As they crossed the threshold into the night, the cold air hit them like a wave, and for a moment they stood in the moonlight, unsure of what to do next. They wandered across the empty quad, the campus eerily silent under the pale glow of the moon. Maya's mind replayed every moment in the chamber, every word Olivia had spoken, and every symbol she had traced. Ethan tried to reassure her that they had done everything they could, but his voice was hollow. Jake walked a few steps behind, lost in his own thoughts. The bell tower loomed in the distance, its windows dark and empty. The friends paused at the edge of the quad, looking back at the library and the tower. Both buildings now seemed to pulse with a quiet menace, as if the campus itself was alive and waiting for something more. The sense of unfinished business hung heavy in the air. The friends stood in silence at the edge of the quad, the weight of everything they had seen pressing down on them. Maya's fingers traced the cover of her sketchbook, if searching for any lingering warmth from the symbols. Ethan stared up at the bell tower, its silhouette sharp against the night sky. Jake finally broke the silence, his voice barely more than a whisper as he asked if they should try to contact someone for help, but the thought of explaining what had happened seemed impossible. The campus was still and empty, the wind carrying only the faintest echo of distant bells. The friends felt isolated from the rest of the world, as if the events of the night had pushed them into a place where time and reality no longer followed the rules. As they debated what to do next, Maya suddenly felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder. She spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty quad, and the long shadows cast by the moon. Ethan and Jake saw the fear in her eyes and moved closer, the three of them forming a tight circle for comfort. The air grew colder, and the wind picked up, swirling leaves around their feet. For a brief moment, Maya thought she heard Olivia's voice carried on the breeze, whispering her name. The friends clung to each other, their fear and grief mingling with a growing sense that the night was not yet over, and that the campus still held secrets waiting to be revealed. The wind howled louder as the friends stood together, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Maya's heart raced as she clutched her sketchbook tighter. Ethan tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself that they had survived the worst, but the campus felt more alive than ever. The windows of the old buildings seemed to flicker with ghostly light, and the bell tower loomed like a silent sentinel. Jake suggested they find somewhere safe to wait for morning, but every building felt haunted, every doorway a possible trap. The friends moved slowly across the quad, their footsteps muffled by the thick grass, the sense of being watched never leaving them as they searched for shelter in the endless night. They found themselves drawn toward the old chapel at the far end of campus, its stained glass windows glowing faintly in the moonlight. Ethan pushed open the heavy wooden doors, and the friends slipped inside. The air was thick with the scent of incense and old wood. The pews cast long shadows across the stone floor. Maya's footsteps echoed as she walked down the aisle, her eyes drawn to the altar where a single candle burned with a blue flame. Jake hesitated at the entrance, his instincts screaming that they should leave, but Ethan urged him forward. The friends gathered at the front of the chapel, the blue candle flickering as if in response to their presence. The silence inside was absolute, broken only by the distant toll of the bell. The blue candle on the altar flickered, casting strange shadows that danced along the chapel walls. Maya felt a chill run down her spine as she stared into the flame, its color unnatural and hypnotic. Ethan knelt beside her, his eyes searching the stained glass for any sign or symbol that might help them. Jake lingered near the entrance, his nerves frayed as he listened for any sound from outside. The silence pressed in on them, heavy and suffocating, the air thick with the weight of old prayers and forgotten secrets. Maya opened her sketchbook, hoping for a sign, but the pages remained dark and empty. The friends huddled together at the altar, the blue light painting their faces with an otherworldly glow. Suddenly, the candle's flame flared brighter, and the stained glass windows shimmered with blue light. Patterns of symbols appeared in the colored glass, matching those Maya had drawn in her sketchbook. Ethan pointed them out, his voice trembling with hope as he realized the chapel itself might be a key to breaking the curse. Jake moved closer to the altar, his fear replaced by determination as he traced the glowing symbols with his finger. Maya began to chant the words she remembered from the ritual, her voice echoing through the empty chapel. The blue light pulsed in time with her words, and the air grew colder. The friends felt a presence gathering around them, as if the spirits of the campus were listening, waiting for the ritual to be complete. The blue light from the candle and the stained glass grew so intense it filled the entire chapel with a cold, shimmering glow. Maya's voice grew stronger as she chanted the ancient words, her breath visible in the freezing air. Ethan and Jake joined in, their voices blending together in a desperate plea for release. The symbols in the glass pulsed with every syllable, casting shifting patterns across the stone floor. The pews creaked as if unseen figures were sitting down to watch the ritual. The friends felt the weight of countless eyes upon them, spirits drawn from every corner of the haunted campus. The air vibrated with energy and the candle's flame stretched higher, reaching for the vaulted ceiling as the ritual neared its climax. Suddenly, the blue flame exploded into a shower of sparks, and the chapel was plunged into darkness. The friends gasped as the temperature dropped even further, and the silence became absolute. Maya's sketchbook began to glow faintly in her hands, the symbols reappearing one by one. Ethan reached out to steady her as Jake scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. A low whisper filled the chapel, growing louder until it became a chorus of voices chanting in unison. The friends pressed closer together, their fear and hope mingling as the ritual's power surged through them. The blue light returned, swirling around the altar and forming the shape of a doorway, shimmering in the air before them. The blue doorway shimmered in the air before them, its surface rippling like water and casting ghostly reflections across the chapel walls. Maya's heart pounded as she realized this was their chance to reach Olivia. Ethan squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with determination. Jake took a deep breath and nodded. The friends stepped forward together, the cold growing sharper with every step. The chorus of voices grew louder, filling the chapel with a haunting melody that seemed to come from both the past and the present. The friends hesitated at the threshold of the doorway, the blue light swirling around their feet, if urging them onward. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, but the need to save Olivia was stronger than their fear. With a final look at each other, the friends stepped through the doorway, the world around them dissolving into a blur of blue light and echoing voices. The sensation was like falling and flying at the same time, the cold biting at their skin as they tumbled through the void. Maya clung to her sketchbook, the symbols glowing brighter than ever. Ethan and Jake reached for her hands, they gripped the only anchor in the swirling chaos. The voices grew louder, then suddenly stopped. The friends landed hard on a stone floor, the blue light fading to reveal a shadowy version of the chapel. Everything distorted and strange, the air thick with the presence of spirits, and the sense that they had crossed into a place where the living did not belong. The friends rose slowly to their feet, their eyes adjusting to the dim blue glow that filled the shadowy chapel. Everything looked familiar yet wrong, the pews twisted and warped, the stained glass windows flickering with ghostly images that shifted and changed. Maya clutched her sketchbook to her chest, the symbols on the pages glowing softly. Ethan scanned the room for any sign of Olivia, his breath visible in the icy air. Jake moved cautiously toward the altar, where the blue light was brightest. The air was thick with whispers, and the sense of being surrounded by unseen eyes. The friends called Olivia's name, their voices echoing strangely in the haunted space, as if the chapel itself was alive and listening. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the far end of the chapel, her form flickering in and out of focus. Olivia stood beneath the largest stained glass window, her eyes wide with fear and hope. Maya ran to her, calling her name as Ethan and Jake followed close behind. The blue light pulsed brighter as the friends reached Olivia, and she reached out to them, her hand trembling. The air grew colder, and the whispers rose to a fever pitch, the spirits in the chapel swirling around the group, if trying to keep them apart. Maya pressed the sketchbook into Olivia's hands, the symbols glowing fiercely. The friends formed a circle around her, their voices joining together in a desperate chant to break the hold of the spirits and bring Olivia back. The blue light from the sketchbook surged as Olivia gripped it tightly, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at her friends. Maya chanted the ancient words, her voice steady and strong. Ethan and Jake joined in, their voices echoing through the twisted chapel. The spirits swirled faster around them, their forms flickering in and out of sight. The stained glass windows pulsed with blue energy, casting shifting patterns across the stone floor. Olivia's form grew more solid with every word, her features sharpening as the barrier between worlds began to thin. The friends held on to each other, their determination stronger than the fear that pressed in from all sides. The air vibrated with power as the ritual reached its peak. Suddenly, the spirits shrieked and recoiled, the blue light exploding outward in a wave that swept through the chapel. The stained glass shattered in a rain of glowing shards, and the spirits were pulled away, screaming into the darkness. Olivia collapsed into Maya's arms, her body warm and real for the first time since she vanished. Ethan and Jake rushed to their side, relief and disbelief written on their faces. The chapel began to tremble, the walls cracking as the blue light faded and the shadows retreated. The friends knew they had to leave before the doorway between worlds closed forever. They helped Olivia to her feet, and together they ran toward the fading portal, the sound of the spirit cries echoing behind them as the chapel crumbled into darkness. The friends burst through the fading blue portal, tumbling back into the real chapel as the first rays of dawn crept through the stained glass windows. The air was warmer now, and the oppressive weight of the spirits was gone. Maya clung to Olivia, tears streaming down her face as Ethan and Jake caught their breath. The chapel was silent except for the sound of their ragged breathing. The blue candle on the altar had burned down to nothing, leaving only a faint wisp of smoke curling into the air. Olivia's skin was cold, but alive, her eyes wide with wonder and exhaustion. The friends looked around in disbelief. The nightmare seemed to be over, but the memory of the other world lingered in every shadow. They helped Olivia to her feet and made their way out of the chapel, the campus bathed in the soft golden light of morning. The bell tower stood silent and still, its windows empty and dark. Maya glanced back at the chapel, her heart pounding as she wondered if the spirits were truly gone or just waiting for another chance. Ethan put his arm around her and promised they would never come back to this place. Jake led the way across the quad, his steps lighter than they had been in days. Olivia walked between her friends, her hand in Maya's, the four of them moving together as the sun rose higher. The nightmare behind them, but the question of what they had unleashed still hanging in the air. The friends walked in silence across the empty campus, the events of the night replaying in their minds with every step. Olivia leaned on Maya, her strength slowly returning as the sun warmed her skin. Ethan kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow following them. Jake tried to lighten the mood with a weak joke, but the laughter died quickly in the morning air. The buildings around them ordinary in the daylight, but the memory of the spirits and the otherworldly chapel clung to every stone. Maya squeezed Olivia's hand, grateful to have her back, but haunted by the knowledge that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. The friends moved together, their bond stronger, but their innocence lost. As they reached the edge of campus, the friends paused to look back at the bell tower and chapel, now bathed in golden light. Olivia whispered a quiet thank you to her friends, her voice trembling with emotion. Ethan promised they would always protect each other, no matter what. Jake took a final photo of the campus, his hands steady for the first time since the nightmare began. Maya closed her eyes and listened to the wind, hoping to hear only silence, but somewhere in the distance the faint sound of a bell echoed through the morning air. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, knowing that the past was never truly gone, and that the shadows of Hawthorne University would always be waiting. The friends left the campus behind, the road stretching out before them as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Maya sat in the back seat next to Olivia, their hands still intertwined. Ethan drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon, while Jake scrolled through the photos on his camera, each image a reminder of the horrors they had faced. The car was quiet, but the air was thick with unspoken questions and the weight of everything they had survived. Olivia stared out the window, her reflection pale and thoughtful in the morning light. The world outside looked normal, but she knew better now. The line between the living and the dead was thinner than anyone realized, and some places never truly let you go. As the campus faded from view, Maya finally broke the silence, her voice soft as she asked if they thought the spirits would ever find peace. Ethan answered quietly that he hoped so, but he wasn't sure. Jake promised to delete the photos once they were safe, but he hesitated, his finger hovering over the button. Olivia squeezed Maya's hand and said she felt different now, as if a part of her was still connected to the other side. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, the memory of the blue light and the echoing bells never far from their minds. The car rolled on into the morning, but the sense of dread lingered, a silent passenger that none of them could shake. The miles slipped by as the friends drove farther from Hawthorne University, but the sense of unease never left them. Maya watched the trees blur past, her mind replaying the moment Olivia's hand slipped through the mirror. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadowy figure in the back seat. Jake finally put the camera away, but the images were burned into his memory. Olivia sat quietly, her gaze distant, as if she was listening to something only she could hear. The car was filled with the soft hum of the engine and the unspoken fear that what they had experienced would follow them wherever they went. The world outside seemed brighter, but the darkness clung to their thoughts. As they neared the city, Maya noticed a strange mark on her wrist, a faint blue symbol that pulsed softly beneath her skin. She showed it to Olivia, who revealed a matching mark on her own arm. Ethan and Jake exchanged worried glances, realizing the connection to the other side had not been fully severed. The friends sat in silence, the weight of the marks heavy on their minds. The city skyline rose ahead, promising safety and normalcy, but the friends knew nothing would ever be the same. The blue light from the campus haunted their memories, and the marks on their skin were a reminder that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. The nightmare was over, but the story was far from finished. The city swallowed them up, the noise and light a stark contrast to the haunted silence of Hawthorne University. But even as they blended into the crowds, Maya could feel the blue mark on her wrist pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Olivia stayed close, her eyes scanning every shadow as if expecting something to follow. Ethan and Jake tried to act normal, laughing at old jokes and talking about the future, but their smiles never quite reached their eyes. The friends moved through the city together, bound by secrets no one else could understand. The world around them was alive and busy, but the memory of the spirits and the blue light lingered just beneath the surface, a silent reminder that the nightmare was never truly gone. That night, as Maya lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she heard the faint sound of bells echoing in the distance. The blue symbol on her wrist glowed softly in the darkness. She closed her eyes, but sleep would not come. Images of the haunted campus, the swirling shadows, and Olivia's desperate face flickered behind her eyelids. Somewhere in the city, a clock tower chimed, and Maya wondered if the spirits had truly been left behind, or if they had simply found a new place to wait. The story of Hawthorne University was over for now, but the marks on their skin and the memories in their minds would never let them forget that some nightmares never end and some doors are never really closed.